cable, any cable on my network from the switch, and you plug into your system, to your laptop, then my DHCP will automatically assign an IP address, automatically without you knowing, to that system from the range that I had defined. So what about there are cases where I need to assign static IP addresses, definitely. For example, my domain controller has to be a static IP address. Even my DHCP server, where did it get the server that it assigned itself? I had to assign the static IP address first before configuring this. What about my router? Where am I going to get? So I need to define to say, even though you are assigning all IP addresses, please reserve these ones. These are the ones I want to use to assign to devices that will be static on the network. For example, my network printer should have a static IP address. I don't want to try to connect to the printer today with one IP address. By the time you reboot and start tomorrow, it's a different IP address. No, my router, anytime the computer wants to browse and it's looking for the gateway, my gateway must have a static IP address. So I need to reserve those IP addresses that I want to use statically. This is why I define it. So I say reserve this one. IP addresses from 192.254.100.10 up to 192.254.100. Baby. Then I say add. So what have I done? I have reserved this IP address. Therefore, when the DHCP is assigning IP addresses, it will not use any of these ones. What will I then use this one for? I can take from here to assign to devices on my network that require static IP address. Get it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so when an IP address is assigned to a device, for how long is that IP address leased to that device? For 8 days by default, or you want to reduce it? I don't have many IP addresses. I don't want people to come to my cyber cafe or my network, my system, my DHCP assigns IP address to them, and then after they leave, they use it only for a few hours. And after they leave, they seize my IP address and make it unavailable because the system knows that IP address has been assigned. It's not available to assign to somebody else. So if you work in that kind of environment, you want to reduce this to even a few hours or 1 day or 24 hours. But if you work in an environment where the systems are always on, nobody lives here, I don't want to, I want the IP address to last as long as possible because you are going to stay here for the next 3 months anyway. Then I could leave it as default or increase it. But normally you don't really, I'm just explaining it so that you understand as the professional that you are becoming, not really because you need to change it. So that's what happens here. So I just leave it as default. And then I say DHCP options. Yes, I want to configure DHCP option. All right. So here we are done with DHCP configuration. But here is the additional configuration that allows you to take from that IP address, that IP address range that you reserved. You can now take from there and begin to assign to. For example, I can say for my router, my router also happens to be my default gateway. I don't know if I've explained that, if you understand what a router is, what a gateway is. So I can now say, of course, my router, you are coming into my network. My router is the man at the gate that you meet first before you come in. So it's the man that takes the number 1 IP address because we are looking at networks that are coming in. So I want you to reserve the IP address 192.254.100.1. But I did not reserve this one. This one will be dynamically assigned. I didn't reserve it. So even if I assign, so it has to be something that I reserved 10.
Oh yes, we did 10 to
From
20.
10 to 20.
20.
Yes. But again, if you are saying that it should have been 1, you are right, because it's just for logical purposes. It's not that it's not like this will not work. This will work. Whatever IP address you assign will work. Well, for somebody who really understands how this thing works, that ideally .1 should be the IP address that you assign to your gateway. But for learning purposes, let's not go back. Let's just leave. When you are configuring you can reserve .1 to 10, and you can start with .11. So I reserve that for what? For router. All right. Anything else I want to reserve IP address? My domain name server. That's another server, another device on the network, another server that requires a static IP address. Incidentally, it has found out by itself that a DHCP is already configured. I mean, a DNS is already configured. All right, and it's with these addresses. But we already assigned this to, we are wrong. Let's go back and change what we assigned here. All right, we'll remove it to 11 or something. I mean, it's better like that. Even though we know that it is the same server right now that is acting as both DHCP and DNS. Let's see, or better still, for our purpose, it is coincidental that we are assigning the same IP address to both the DHCP and the DNS because just one system that performs both functions. Do you get that? So for this particular configuration that we are doing, we have only one server, and that server is our DHCP server and our DNS server, and even our domain controller. It is one IP address per server, not one IP address per service, one IP address per computer. So what is the IP address of the computer that does our DSP here?
That's 192.254.10,
right?
Yes.
Correct. That is for what? For which service?
DHCP.
All right. So what's the IP address of the machine that does our DNS on this our domain?
It's still the same thing.
It's the same thing, the same IP address. That's exactly what I'm saying. That for this experiment, for this configuration we are doing, IP address for DHCP is the same as IP address for DNS. That's what so now that you understand what I'm saying, this my level is wrong for this purpose. It's still 10 because it's the same machine that is doing all of this. The router, the DHCP, the DNS. We don't have multiple machines. By the time we begin to configure multiple machines, we can begin to assign them different IP address. All right, so let's leave that as it. And then what's this? Wins. We don't need wins. Wins is old-fashioned legacy. And then do you want to activate your scope now? Of course, activate my scope, yes, and then finish. So this is how to configure DHCP. I've configured the DHCP server. I mean, basically within Windows. By the time you get to Linux, it might be a bit more, or basically you have configured the DHCP server for one. What do? Just define your scope. That's all. Define scope. You have to reserve IP addresses to reserve. So this DHCP that you have configured now, in the process of configuration, I've explained to you what it does. So that answers your question. The person who asked, what do DHCP servers do and why do we need them? So do you understand what they do now?
Assign IP.
Assigning. All right. So that's how to configure. Any question? All right. No question. So let's also go and configure DNS. All right. So if you look here now, you'll find that look at the option. You can refresh. You can see the pool that we define. The scope that we define. You can see them from this to this. And then we reserve from here to here. IP address list. That's the major place we define. We didn't really change any of that. Scope options. We assigned we assigned this, if you remember. DNS and we actually saw that you already assumed some figures. No? You already picked the actual figures from the configuration, so we just left it. All right, so that's how to configure. Of course, like I always advise, play around and see what these other things offer. You don't have to know them because they are just learning. You don't have to know everything from the wall, but just know that you need to do more than you have done. Tools are there. But what you need to do basically is what we have done. All right, so we are done with DHCP. What about DNS? How do we configure DNS server? This one is already DNS server. We don't really have to. It's already DNS server. There's no special configuration for DNS server. But I'll show you something. The next thing I want to show you is what if we want to separate the DHCP function from this server? Set up another server. That will require me to set up another. Okay, this is what I mean. Right now, our server is the domain controller for DHCP and DNS, right?
Yes.
What if we want to set up a dedicated DHCP server and separate the function from the domain controller machine? We can do it. Yes. The new virtual machine would now be what? All right.